Hi, I'm Martin Felsen. Welcome to City Design, where we explore how we shape cities and how cities shape us. This episode, Ancient Greece, the Oracle, Olympics, and Agora, is the fifth in a series on city history. Last episode, we explored the ancient Minoans of Crete, whose trading network across the Aegean evolved into what we now call ancient Greece. This episode is about the rise of the Greek city-state, the Polis, and the Acropolis of Athens, roughly between 800 and 400 BCE. We'll also dig into the contradictions built into ancient Greek urban life, including a democracy that excluded most of the people living within it. Let's start with a classic contradiction between free will and the illusion of choice. In ancient Greece, oracles stood right in the middle of the paradox. You might remember the oracle from The Matrix. She's an AI agent designed to read a person's mind, anticipate what they'll do, and nudge them toward a decision they'll believe was their own. Her job is to guide the human resistance toward peace with the machines. Greek oracles played a similar role, minus the machines. They existed to keep the peace between cities, and the most important oracle of them all was at Delphi. Delphi was designed so leaders from every Greek city had a reason to show up in the same place at the same time. Political and military figures came to consult the oracle before any major decision like going to war, founding a colony, or rewriting a law. And while they waited their turn to meet the oracle, they met each other. They talked, they negotiated. This is where ancient Greek diplomacy, and sometimes peace, actually happened. The oracle, known as Pythia, was the high priestess of the Temple of Apollo. She was a real person, chosen to serve as oracle for life. Because she was understood to speak for the gods, her guidance gave leaders the moral authority to act or to not act on difficult decisions. After all, humans need free will, or at least the illusion of it, to live with the choices we make. Every major city-state built a small outpost at Delphi, something like an embassy. The closeness was the point. The site was designed for encounters between leaders. Delphi was perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, tucked between two limestone cliffs. The Greeks called them the Shining Rocks for the way they flash in the sun. Delphi's location was chosen by the gods. In the myth of the oracle, Zeus released two eagles from opposite ends of the world, one flying east, one flying west. Where they met, he marked the ground with a sacred stone called the Omphalos, the navel of the world. A temple rose on that spot, guarded by Apollo, who had defeated the serpent Python to claim the sanctuary for himself. Inside the sanctuary, Pythia delivered her prophecies through a state of divine possession. How she actually entered the trance is still debated. Some scholars point to prayer and fasting. Others suspect ethylene gas leaking from a geological fault beneath the temple. The truth is still buried in the mountain. What's clear is that leaders took her seriously. Rulers came to Delphi before declaring war, before founding colonies across the Mediterranean, before overhauling religious law. And Delphi became more than sacred ground. It became a stage. Rival cities advertised their successes at Delphi. After a victory, or a strong year of trade, a city might commission a statue, a monument, or an entire treasury building filled with offerings to Apollo. Athenians, Spartans, Macedonians each left their mark. The oracle's prophecies were more like riddles than rulings. Know thyself, carved at the entrance to the sanctuary, and above this entry are good examples. Her answers required interpretation and conversation, which of course was the point. Public life at Delphi wasn't only about private consultations. Just above the temple is the theater, carved in the hillside, open to the sky, framing the valley below. The Greeks believed sacred sites carried meaning long before any city designer arrived on site. The architect's job wasn't to impose abstract geometry onto the site. It was to find what was already sacred in the landscape and make it visible. That's why there's no urban grid at Delphi. Buildings are positioned to be seen from specific, oblique vantage points as sculptural objects in a landscape. Stand in the theater and look out across the curved bowl of mountains. We can see how each temple, treasury, and monument each rotate in space, framing views of the peaks and, in the distance, the sea. The buildings don't impose on the site, they activate it. Ancient Greece wasn't one country. It was hundreds of small, fiercely competitive city-states, often at war with each other, which meant peace had to be designed. Delphi was one attempt, Olympia was another. Every 4 years, every Greek city sent athletes, poets, and spectators to the urban sanctuary at Olympia. And for the duration of the games, a sacred truce, the Ekakeria, was declared across the Greek world. Wars were paused, armies stood down, travelers and athletes could cross hostile borders freely under the protection of Zeus. To harm a pilgrim on the road to Olympia was considered an act of sacrilege. The myth goes like this. After Hercules completed his 12 labors, he built a stadium at Olympia as an offering to his father, Zeus. He paced off the length of the stadium himself, 200 steps in a straight line, and called the distance a stadion. The first recorded Olympic Games occurred in 776 BCE. We know the date because inscriptions at Olympia list the winners of a foot race, the stadion sprint, held every 4 years. For the first several decades, that was the entire event. One race, once every 4 years. The winner was so celebrated that the next 4-year cycle, the Olympiad, was named after him. Over time, the program expanded. A pentathlon was begun: long jump, discus, javelin, sprint, and wrestling. And chariot races were held in the Hippodrome. Poets and musicians competed alongside the athletes. The festival honored the body and the mind, both understood as foundations of human excellence. The official prize for winning at Olympia was a wreath of olive leaves. That was it. No medals, no money, no trophies. But Olympic victories were immortalized in poems and statues. To win at Olympia was to become a national hero. At the religious heart of the sanctuary stood the Temple of Zeus, built in the mid-5th century BCE. Inside it was a 40-foot statue of Zeus himself, carved in ivory and gold by the sculptor Phidias, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Olympia was a collection of more than 70 temples, along with altars, treasuries, and countless statues dedicated to Greek gods and heroes. It was a miniature city of religion and sport, and, like Delphi, a place where rival city-states came to market themselves. Olympia's lasting contribution to the city was about training. The athletic facilities at Olympia began a new class of civic buildings like the Palestra, a dedicated wrestling ground. The Palestra eventually evolved into the Gymnasium, an enclosed complex with training facilities and public baths and classrooms. The Greek idea was that the body and mind should be trained together. Athletes who spent their mornings wrestling were expected to spend their afternoons reading, debating, and thinking. 3 of Athens' most respected schools, the Academy, the Lyceum, and the Cynosarges, began as sacred groves attached to gymnasiums. The Olympic ideal gave Western civilization the modern school. In the 6th century BCE, earthquakes and floods buried Olympia under 26 feet of silt. The site disappeared from memory, which ironically protected it. Grave robbers couldn't find what no one remembered. Excavations began in 1875 and slowly revealed structures like the Philippion Temple and the Temple of Hera. But the statue of Zeus was never recovered. Like the pharaohs of Alexandria, it vanished from the ancient world, leaving only monumental descriptions. The Games of Olympia were revived in 1894 by educators who wanted to restore the ancient ideal of peaceful international competitions of excellence. The first modern Olympics opened in Athens in 1896 in the Panathenaic Stadium below the Acropolis. It's still the only major stadium in the world built entirely of marble. Still today, before every modern Olympic Games, the torch completes a relay through Greece and is handed off in the Panathenaic Stadium to the host city. The ritual is modern, the meaning is ancient. For the ancient Greeks, Olympia and Delphi did something modest yet radical. They gave citizens of rival cities a reason to travel, to meet strangers, to compete peacefully, and to return home changed. The Olympics, the Pythian Games at Delphi, the Isthmian Games, the Nemean Games. Together, these four Pan-Hellenic festivals connected the Greek world. But not through conquest or empire, but through periodic, peaceful assembly, a model the modern world still borrows from. In the eastern Aegean, just off the coast of modern Turkey, is a small Greek island named Kos. For much of the ancient world, Kos was the place you went when you were sick. The island was the sacred home of Asclepius, the Greek god of healing. His sanctuary on Kos was called the Asclepion, and it was something new in the ancient world. Not just a temple or shrine, but a sanatorium, a medical school, and a hospital, all in one. Patients traveled to Kos from across the Mediterranean because Kos is where Hippocrates set up his school and healing center in the 5th century BCE. Hippocrates is often called the father of medicine, not because he was the first doctor, but because he was the first we know of to insist that illness had natural causes, not supernatural ones. To Hippocrates, disease wasn't a curse. It wasn't divine punishment. It was something that happened in the body and something that could be studied and ideally fixed. The Asclepion complex was built upon Hippocrates' research. The sanctuary was terraced into a hillside above the sea, surrounded by mulberry trees and vineyards. The physicians at Kos understood something modern hospitals are still rediscovering: that open space, serenity, salt air, and green spaces can be part of a cure. It's a remarkable idea that nature, thoughtfully shaped, can heal more effectively than nature left wild. One of the most important Hippocratic treatises is called Airs, Waters, and Places. It's an early manual for city planning, built from what Greek physicians had observed about what keeps people healthy, such as orient buildings and streets to catch cooling breezes and avoid harsh summer sun, avoid wetland, secure clean sources of drinking water. These prescriptions seem obvious now. They weren't obvious then, and they were expensive. Aqueducts and amphitheaters, parks and waterfronts were major public works then, as they are now. The connection Hippocrates drew between place and health has really never gone away. Urban planners still argue about sunlight and airflow, green space and walkability, whether a city's design is making its residents sicker or healthier. 2,400 years later, we're still asking the questions that Hippocrates asked. At the spiritual heart of every polis stood the Acropolis, literally high city, a rocky outcrop elevated above the streets below. In earlier eras, the Acropolis had held a citadel, a fortified complex for a king. But sometime around the 7th century BCE, the citadel gave way to the temple. The design of the Greek temple originally began as a humble, primitive hut. The entrance area, framed with wooden columns, originally trees, eventually turned to marble. Inside stood a god, often a giant statue painted in brilliant colors, eyes set with jewels. Phidias, who also carved the lost statue of Zeus at Olympia, sculpted Athena for the Parthenon. Greek temples weren't designed to hold a congregation. Rituals happened outside, in the surrounding sacred precinct. The temple was the house of God, not a meeting hall for worshippers. The Greek temple was a sculpture to be approached, not a container to be entered. And the gods themselves were changing. By the 5th century BCE, they were less like distant divinities and more like embodiments of human qualities. Hestia for hearth and home, Artemis for fertility and the hunt, Apollo for reason and art. The gods had become, in a sense, projections of Greek virtues. And by the time Athens built the Parthenon, a new god had quietly taken the hill, the Polis, or the city itself, and the citizens themselves. Athens had started worshipping its own image of wisdom and order. Constructing the Parthenon, one of the great public works projects in urban history, was led by Pericles. But it wasn't paid for by piety, it was paid for by empire. Athens had turned a defensive alliance of Greek cities, the Delian League, into a system of tribute. Money flowed from the allied islands into Athens, and a significant portion of it built the Parthenon. This same imperial logic produced the massacre at Milos, where Athens executed every adult male on an island that had simply tried to stay neutral. The historian Thucydides recorded the Athenian position plainly: the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. This is the paradox at the heart of the Athenian Golden Age. Great cities and moral blindness have a long history together. Yet the Parthenon remains remarkable not just for what it represented, but for how it was designed and built. Let's begin by looking at the design of Greek pottery and sculpture. Compare an ancient Egyptian figure to a classical Greek one. The Egyptian stands frontal and rigid, symmetrical, fixed in place. The early Greek figure, the Critios boy, shifts his weight. His hips tilt one way, his shoulders the other. The Greeks called this contrapposto, counter posture. By the time Polykleitos carved the Doryphorus, the twist is fully developed. The body turns in sculpted space. And that same sensibility, a body alive in space, barely yielding to gravity, shows up in Greek architecture. Look closely at the Parthenon. Almost nothing is actually perfectly straight. The columns bulge slightly. They lean inward a few degrees. The platform curves gently upward in the center. The spacing between columns varies from one bay to the next. Exaggerate these corrections and the building looks a little wobbly. But at real scale, these optical illusions are imperceptible. Their goal is to make the building look straight and even. The Greeks understood that the eye doesn't exactly want geometric perfection. The eye wants the appearance of perfection, which sometimes requires purposeful imperfections. Where the Acropolis was the spiritual center of the Greek city, the Agora was its civic center. The Agora, meaning to gather, is where democracy was born, not in a palace, but in a public square at the foot of the Acropolis. The Agora wasn't planned as much as it simply evolved over time. It was a collection of ever-expanding temples, workshops, fountains, government buildings, and the long, covered colonnades called stoas. It was crowded, noisy, and purposefully multi-purpose. The poet Eubulus observed that in the Athenian Agora, you could buy figs and lawsuits side by side. The Greeks believed that for a participatory democracy to work, citizens have to encounter each other as often as possible. The Agora made the encounter part of daily life. A few buildings are worth naming. The Bouleuterion, the council house, held meetings of the Boule, a committee of 500 citizens chosen by lottery each year to draft legislation for the Polis. Next to it stood the Tholos, a round building that served as the meeting place for 50 rotating council members who steered the daily business of government. Citizens passing through the Agora on their way to the market would see the Tholos at work. Democracy was on public view. And there were chloroteria, marble voting machines used to select jurors at random. Citizens slipped bronze identity tokens into slots. A rod released colored balls that determined who was chosen. A lottery built of stone. In the city's largest courts, jurors voted using bronze discs, solid ones for one verdict, hollow ones for another. Cast by hand into urns, they preserved anonymity. All this was the physical infrastructure of the first true democracy. And yet, for all of its innovation, Athenian democracy had a deep structural flaw. Most people living in Athens weren't citizens. Women, regardless of their background, couldn't vote or hold office. Enslaved people had no rights at all. And there was an important third group, free foreigners known as metics. They lived in Athens, they paid taxes, many of them ran the city's most important commercial enterprises, and they were permanently excluded from citizenship. The numbers are striking. Fewer than 1 in 7 residents of classical Athens held the full rights of citizenship. The democracy that ran the city was a minority government, a privileged club surrounded by the majority it excluded. The world's first democracy was, from the start, a democracy of the few. The Greek aristocracy looked down on trade. Commerce was considered beneath a gentleman. Real citizens owned land. Real citizens farmed, fought, and philosophized. Buying and selling was beneath them. So the Greeks handed most of their commercial life to the metics, and then refused to let them participate in government. The commercial class that generated the city's wealth couldn't vote. This split between the class that made the money and the class that made the laws would run through commercial cities that followed and eventually develop into what we now call capitalism. The Agora itself embodied the contradiction. It was the most democratic space in the ancient world and one of the most unequal. By the 5th century BCE, Athens had outgrown face-to-face politics. The citizen body was too large for everyone to know everyone, and still, everyone had to show up for every decision. But the Greeks never took the next step. They never invented representative government. They couldn't quite bring themselves to delegate their vote to anyone else. Delphi, Olympia, Kos, the Acropolis, the Agora, 5 urban experiments. The Greek gave modern cities much of the civic vocabulary we still use: democracy, politics, philosophy, academy. But the Greeks also exposed the shape of some problems we're still trying to solve: how to build cities that belong to everyone who lives in them, how to make power transparent enough to be accountable and shared enough to be fair. In the next episode, we'll follow these Greek ideas across the Mediterranean as the ancient city continued to spread and evolve. Thanks for watching City Design. See you next time as we keep exploring how we shape cities and how cities shape us.